So we now are in the second chapter, and we're going to be talking about the International Bronze Age and its aftermath. Um, I'm going to cover some of the first part of this chapter and its general outline, and then what I'm going to do is I want you to read the whole text, the whole chapter, of course, but I'm going to do a separate, kind of longer discussion of the ancient Hebrews, because I think that they are, out of this section, the most crucial for us to understand in terms of the development of Western civilization. But in the meantime, we're going to cover just a few points here that are from the book that I just kind of want to go over and talk. Okay, so let's move on. Here's a map. Maps are good. Maps are great. Please always use maps. Get familiar with maps. Americans are infamous for not knowing geography. And I have to admit, as a person who has taught in the public school system for many years, mainly as a sub, but sometimes doing long-term teaching and all different grades, I can't think of any time that I ever saw a class ever being taught like actually the entire globe and to know where places are at. They learn about like longitude and latitude and maybe a little section of Europe when they cover World War I or World War II, but not really like the map. So just to be aware. I mean, it's helpful because then it also starts to give you a picture as to why certain people have conflicts all the time. If you just, for example, before we even move on, here in the Assyrian Empire and the Kassite Babylonian, which we're going to be talking about, you'll notice here's the Persian Gulf. Now this is modern Iraq, but Kuwait is right here. And what you'll notice then is that this country, this block, if you're looking at my arrow, by the way, as I'm moving it around, it doesn't have access to the Persian Gulf. The country of Kuwait landlocks it. And the British actually created Kuwait in the 1920s. Sir Percy Cox essentially made this a nation, and Iraqi nationalists always have felt that that was like denying them access to the Persian Gulf to have a stronger navy. And then, of course, an oil gets found, and that's a whole other thing. But, Ethiopia and Eritrea have long wars based over access to ports. And so I hope you're following what I'm saying. It's just that geography matters. It helps us kind of visualize and put into place more of what we're dealing with. Again, if we look at this map now, who we're talking about, look at how all these nations are exposed to each other with very little protection overall. And so it's easy to see how you can keep having invaders coming from out here in the Caucasus, or out of Dimension X over here from the right, whatever. You're going to have to have strong nation states, strong men often, most of the time, or kings, that are going to create militaries and militarize society to be able to keep peace with your neighbors, or to be able to war and win with your neighbors, right? And we're going to, we just talked about Egypt, and you see that Egypt has this large Sinai desert. It's talked about in the Bible all the time. And that is a kind of a rough terrain to go through in terms of heat and lack of water. But you can see going through the, by boat, Canaan is right here, and Syria. And this is the biblical lands of Palestine/Israel. And here you have what is modern Turkey now, the Hittite Empire. And then over here we have in the Mediterranean what would be now Greece. Okay. And so, this gives us kind of like a picture of where we're at for the groups that we're discussing. Keep in mind here, Mediterranean Sea, right? Persian Gulf, and I think that's good to kind of visualize for now. Okay, so we are going to talk about zones of power within the International Bronze Age. The Hittites, the Battle of Kadesh, and what that was significant for, and then just briefly cover the Kassite Babylonian kingdom and its relations to Assyria. So first, let's talk about what's in the book when it's referring to the International Bronze Age. All right, so they're basically talking about this period that does not last long, right? It's 1200 to 1100 BCE, well, excuse me, 1500 to 1100 BCE. I know I had that wrong, so pardon me. 1500 to 1100 BCE, and it talks about there being unprecedented degrees of trade and diplomatic exchange. So here is where we're really talking about having more information to work with as historians. You recall when in my last lecture, I was saying when we look at what so-called prehistory, we're going back in time with very little materials. And so it becomes much more difficult to construct what's going on, what do people actually think or believe, or to even guess. Well, here at this time, trade to do business is going to create cultural exchange, right? I mean, food, clothing that people will wear, slaves, all sorts of things that are going to create cultural shifts. And then wars, of course, always do that as well. Okay, so I'm just going to focus briefly on some of the main points of what we want to know about these histories. So just looking at the Hittites, we don't probably hear them talked about as much as Assyria and Babylon, or Greece or Rome, but they were a significant power during this time. And the things that becomes most important for us to realize is that the way that they ruled and how they had their power really helped bring in a lot of cultures and spread out many different ideas. So for one, if you look on page 46, just the way that they handled religion was interesting, right? So, ruling over many different peoples, how do you create some sort of unity? You can do like what, Rome would do later, or, Islam, Christianity, where you force one religion on the populations that you rule and create a unified empire with one unified religion. Now, of course, those religions are not always about force. I realize I said something kind of controversial, but in the era of empires, Christianity and Islam was used as a unifying factor, and it was the dominant religion used as they expanded their empires. And we'll talk more about that later when we go over Christianity and Islam just a little bit in the future. But in this case, the way he did, the concept of the monarchy had to rule these people was to bring all the gods to the capital of Hattusha and many temples for them. So he basically wanted to have all religions kind of brought together and put into one place and let them be basically the religions of the empire. And the book points out that there were obviously a lot of contradictions in this, because if you have a story about creation, I mean, let's just take the Epic of Gilgamesh and let's take the Bible. Well, yes, they have similar stories, right? But they're two different stories. Even the flood story, you still have two different stories. You have a flood with similar themes, but you still have two different things. And if we're going to take those as literal history, they can't both be right at the same time. But of course, what this monarch was no doubt trying to do was, not worry about the theological or philosophical complications of this arrangement, but the politically pragmatic aspects of it. I will stop here and move on to the next lecture.